Hi everyone, this is Sarfraz from Aristotle Prep, and we are looking at passage number 22 from the OG 13 RC chapter. This has questions 111 to 114. It's a one paragraph passage, so we will first read the entire passage, we will try to understand it in great detail, then we will come up with a purpose for the passage, and then we will look at the questions. The first sentence is very important. While the most abundant and dominant species within a particular ecosystem is often crucial in perpetuating the ecosystem, a keystone species, here defined as one whose effects are much larger than would be predicted from its abundance, can also play a vital role. So, in the first sentence, I know the whole passage will be something about these species which are mentioned called keystone species. And what are keystone species? Keystone species are species which are not present in huge numbers or not in such big numbers that one would think they are very important, but there is something about these species that makes them very, very important for the ecosystem. So, okay. So basically, there's a disconnect between the number of this species in an ecosystem and the impact it has on the ecosystem. But because complex species interactions may be involved, identifying a keystone species by removing the species and observing changes in the ecosystem is problematic. Okay, so how does one identify a keystone species then? It might seem that certain traits would clearly define a species as a keystone species. For example, Pisaster ochraceus is often a keystone predator because it consumes and suppresses mussel populations. Okay, which in the absence of this starfish can be a dominant species. So that is the impact of this keystone species, that it is suppressing the dominant species. But such predation on a dominant or potentially dominant species occurs in systems that do, as well as in systems that do not, have species that play keystone roles. So even if a species were not a keystone species, it can still eat other potentially dominant species. Fine, whatever. Moreover, whereas P. ochraceus occupies an unambiguous keystone role on wave-exposed rocky headlands, in more wave-sheltered habitats, the impact of P. ochraceus predation is weak or non-existent, and at certain sites, sand burial is responsible for eliminating mussels. So it is interesting. It says that in certain areas, P. ochraceus is very effective as a keystone species. In certain other areas, it's not effective at all. Keystone status appears to depend on context, exactly. Whether of particular geography or of such factors as community diversity. For example, a reduction in species diversity may thrust more of the remaining species into keystone roles, and length of species interaction, since newly arrived species in particular may dramatically affect ecosystems. Be careful of these two brackets, these two lines in brackets, because typically when you see something in brackets, you definitely get questioned on that. So the whole passage is basically about keystone species, and it describes what is a keystone species, and then it takes a particular case of this P. ochraceus and goes on to say that it doesn't act as a keystone species in every environment. So whether a species is keystone or not depends on context, things such as geography, community diversity, and length of species interaction. That's the entire passage for you. It's a neutral passage. The author does not have any agenda in the passage. So with that thought process, we will now look at the questions. The first question, which is 111, the passage mentions which of the following as a factor that affects the role of P. ochraceus as a keystone species within different habitats. It mentioned basically wave sheltered and wave exposed. So wave movement or something on those lines should be the answer. Actually, A is the answer. A says the degree to which the habitat is sheltered from waves. That is the answer straight away. Because you see, in wave sheltered habitats, P. ochraceus behaves differently. In the other habitat which is exposed to waves, wave exposed habitat, basically it behaves differently. So A is definitely your answer. B says the degree to which other animals within a habitat prey on mussels, that is not, the habitat part is not connected to that. C says the fact that mussel populations are often not dominant within some habitats, so what? D says the size of P. ochraceus population is irrelevant. E says the fact that there is great species diversity within some habitats occupied by P. ochraceus is of no use to us. A immediately was the answer. You should have had the answer in mind because otherwise you can get confused.